Algebra Chapter 2, Lessons 1 and 2, and we want to wrap these two lessons up by looking at what we call absolute value. Now, before we talk about absolute value on a number line, I want to talk about what the term absolute value actually means. When we're talking about absolute value, what we're really talking about is the size or the bigness of a particular quantity, usually a number. In other words, if I have 100 and I have a negative 100, what's the value of those numbers? Well, they both have a size of 100. They're both 100. The only difference is one is positive, one is negative. When you think about having $100 in the bank, you have a positive $100. If you talk about owing someone $100, you have a negative $100. And so what's the difference in size between those numbers? Well, there is no difference. They're both $100. One is just to the good, positive, and one is to the bad, negative. So when we're talking about absolute value, we're not really talking about the negative sign and positive or negative. We're really not concerned with that. Well, the only thing we're concerned about is the size of the number. Now, when we're talking about the size of a number in terms of a number line, the size of a number, the absolute value, is its distance from zero. So really, when we look at an absolute value symbol, what we need to think is, well, how far is this number that's inside away from zero? And it doesn't matter whether it's to the right or to the left. That's just the direction. The distance is what we're concerned about. Now, if we look at negative 3 and 3, they're both 3 units away from 0. It doesn't matter whether I go to the right 3 or to the left 3. How far have I gone? 3. And so the absolute value of both numbers is 3 because we're only interested in how far it is. We don't care about whether we're going right or left. The absolute value symbol doesn't care. It just wants to know how far you're going. So we want to kind of think of absolute value in those terms. Absolute value, the absolute value is the distance from 0 that the number is on the number line. And we use these two vertical bars to indicate the absolute value. So then what's inside is what we're trying to figure out, how far is that away from 0. So an example of that would be the absolute value of 8. Okay, notice the English phrase, the absolute value of 8, and notice the mathematical phrase written with two vertical bars and the number 8 on the inside. Now, when we're asked to simplify an absolute value, in order to simplify it, you are going to ask yourself a question, and the answer to that question is the absolute value simplified. So the question you want to ask yourself is, how far is, and then this number that's inside the absolute value, away from 0? How far is this value away from 0? So if we're looking at the absolute value of 8 and I ask you to simplify it, you would ask yourself this question. How far is 8 away from 0? If I was standing at 0 and I wanted to get to 8, how far would I have to go? Well, I'd have to go 8 units. Now I want you to notice how the absolute value symbol is not part of the answer, because once you've answered the question, you simplified the absolute value. You answered the question, so the absolute value symbols are no longer needed. This number is 8 units away from 0. So by answering the question, we've simplified the expression. So let's take a look at this value. The absolute value of negative 7. So the question is, how far is negative 7 away from 0? If I'm standing at 0 and I need to go to negative 7, how far would I have to go? Well, I have to go 7 units. Okay. Now again, I want you to notice the negative sign and the absolute value sign is not part of the answer, because we're not asking the negative sign really just tells me which direction to go, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The absolute value question is, how far do I go? Doesn't matter the direction. Is it to the right, to the left? Doesn't matter. How far do you have to go? 7 units. Okay? So the answer to the question, or the simplified answer, is 7 units. Now, let's talk about this negative sign. This is going to be very important later on when we look at adding these numbers and doing some other things. A negative sign can be many things and can indicate many things. However, what we're talking about, and many times in mathematics, a negative sign is going to indicate the direction not the value of the number. We really don't care about, it doesn't affect the size of the number. In other words, it doesn't affect that we're 7 units away from 0. The negative sign only indicates that I go to the left. When we're talking about the Cartesian plane later on, when we have the y-axis, the negative sign will indicate down. And in physics, you'll get to know this when you're talking about forces and the direction that the force is acting. If the force is acting in an upward direction, it's positive. If it's acting in a downward direction, it's negative. But it really doesn't affect the value of the force or the size of the force. It's just indicating direction. So the negative sign in many cases is simply going to indicate the direction that we have to go. The absolute value is concerned, well, okay, well, how far do I have to go? What's the size that I have to go in that direction? So on a number line, when we're talking about a horizontal number line, a negative sign will indicate a move to the left. A positive sign or lack of a negative sign would indicate a move to the right. And what we're concerned with absolute value then is simply how far do we have to go. So absolute value then, to kind of wrap this up, it's a question of the size of the number. And we're talking about number line, we're talking about how far from 0. The distance or the size that we have to go from 0 can be in either direction. And that really doesn't matter in terms of its size. So when we're asked for the absolute value, we're looking for the distance from 0 or the size of the number, the actual value of the number, not the direction.